Be the Talk, episode 166, featuring Brian Snee. Welcome to Be the Talk. We go behind the talk 7 days a week for tips and techniques to help you change the world. I'm Nathan Eckel, and a talker myself. I'm interviewing others who change the world with their talk. You can too, even if you've never given a talk before. Let's get started with today's show. We are live with Brian Snee. Brian, are you ready to talk?
I am. Thanks, Nathan.
Brian J. Snee is the author of Lincoln Before Lincoln. He is the professor and chair of communication and media at Manhattanville College. Brian Snee, welcome to the talk.
Thanks for having me.
So your talk is called How the Virtue of Eloquence Became a Vice. It was a TEDx WCC talk. Please take us behind that talk. I loved how you really deconstructed how in modern times we look at it as a vice, but before then it was really a virtue. So please take us behind that talk.
Sure. Thanks, Nathan. If you listen to the talk, and I know that you did, it probably won't surprise you to hear me say that what inspired it was the 2016 presidential election.
It inspires a lot of talks these days.
Right. One of the cardinal rules of TED Talks is that they shouldn't be political, and they certainly shouldn't be partisan. And I wanted to respect that because that's what I love about TED Talks. They're unifying. We come together around an idea. So I had a kind of unique challenge where I wanted to create a talk in which probably the most important thing I would say wouldn't exist in the words. If you look at the transcript of the talk, probably the takeaway that most people went home with wouldn't be there on paper. And the larger point that I wanted to make was, as you referenced already, great leaders have almost always been great communicators, and communication has almost always been understood to be a useful skill. It's an asset and not a liability. There's no reason that we shouldn't try to become better writers or better speakers, even though most of us will never be great. And it seemed to me in my lifetime that that's been changing. I tell my students, and I have for 25 years, that they should become as good as they possibly can be. And then when I walk outside the classroom, I can't deny that we live in a world in which we sometimes reject people, not in spite of their communication skills, but because of them. And that seemed to me so strange and potentially so damaging that I wanted to devote my talk to that.
Well, and it's very interesting. It's the trend of everything. People call it the dumbing down of society. I know for generations we've been bemoaning and wringing our hands. We have this other trend of what I call branded talks. You know it as TED Talks, where you have experts in the fields are kind of de-experting their jargon and the trade words to be able to say in simpler language the same concepts, and really building a bridge to kind of the everyday man, every woman out there. And I, appreciate and respect you for being one of the people that did that. I wonder if it's the advent of technology, the advent of mass advertising, where we've started to associate the silver-tongued snake oil salespeople with this reluctance to accept people who are more articulate and eloquent. What are your thoughts on that, Brian?
It might be. It might be social media as well. Now we all have a voice. We can all enter into the public sphere. We might not have a big audience. It may just be our friends and family on Facebook. But whatever the cause, I tried to make clear in the talk that I'm a big fan of plain speech. When I say the word eloquence, I don't mean that it has to be soaring rhetoric. No one starts their TED Talk with 7 years ago, or should they, right? That's language from a different era. I'm all for people who, speak plainly and directly, but there's a difference between that and someone who can't find the end of their sentence. Being inarticulate doesn't mean you're not intelligent. But at the same time, being inarticulate doesn't mean that you're necessarily honest or that you're necessarily going to be the most experienced. And it struck me that it wasn't that long ago that we all called Ronald Reagan the great communicator. Yeah. And whether you liked Reagan or didn't, that was a compliment and not an insult when people said it. Fast forward a couple of decades, and we now insult people by talking about how all they can do is give speeches. And to me, that's worrisome when we disqualify from public life anyone who sounds remotely articulate. What does that leave us with? And that was something that I know when I talk to students about it, first of all, it seems not to have occurred to at least some of them. And so I thought perhaps that my audience at the event might find that illuminating as well. But it also presents a challenge for me as a professor. What do I tell my students? They're about to go out into the world of the 21st century. Do I tell them, when you go to a job interview, dumb it down? When your boss asks you to write a memo, make sure there's some misspellings in it. I would never say those things, but I know that there are certain times they're going to be disliked, at least, if not disqualified, if they appear to be too articulate and too intellectual.
Brian Snee dropping some bombs on us here today, Talk Universe. It hadn't occurred to me the double standard between holding up Reagan as the great communicator, and holding, kind of our most recent president, and many people criticizing him because he could use a teleprompter or he could give a good speech, but the implication was there wasn't much beyond that. So good for you. Bonus points for, bringing that to my awareness. Brian,
sure.
you wrote this book, Lincoln Before Lincoln. I'd love to ask you your opinion on how Lincoln really utilized kind of the social media of his day. My words, certainly not yours, but I was, in recent months and maybe a couple of years back, I realized Abraham Lincoln, when he came and made his big campaign thrust, the first thing he did when he came out east, if my history is correct, and it may not be, but if the documentaries I saw are correct, the first thing he did, he comes out from the backwoods of Illinois to New York City, gets suited up, gets his trademark top hat, and goes into a photo studio to have celebrity photos made of him and uses those for his campaign. Number one, is that more or less correct? And number two, what do you think about the way that Lincoln utilized the mass media of his day to communicate?
To my knowledge, at least, some of that is correct.
Lincoln
Before Lincoln, my book is about representations of Lincoln in Hollywood films. And so I sort of come at Lincoln from the other end of the spectrum. But still, I think I agree, and I think your point is valid, that Lincoln was probably more shrewd than we give him credit for being. I think Spielberg's most recent and popular film explored that side of him. And even he was known to dumb it down. We can, reread some of his great speeches. As far as we know, he never spoke that way in day-to-day life, nor would one expect him to. And in fact, it sounds like he was quite the storyteller, that he almost spoke in simple parables because he understood that people would understand him and maybe relate to him in that way. So we're probably not seeing much today that public figures and politicians haven't always done. It does seem to me, though, as you suggested, that the culture now is different, and that we are not only less comfortable around people who don't talk like we do, we're suspicious of them. I think we've come to believe that if somebody speaks in plain English, we'd probably know if they were lying. That, I think, is a dangerous assumption. We tell ourselves that we could see through the lie if the person doesn't sound like they're normally giving oratorical addresses.
So going back to what you were talking about, Brian, a moment ago, it seems like Lincoln really could, and this is my word, not yours, but code switch. And so if he's in public, he's able to give a nice prepared, a little bit more highbrow oratory, which was par for the course and expected and required at that level. But then if he's at the bar, or if he's networking or politicking, he was able to really talk the common language and be a little bit maybe even self-depreciating and really be really, we call that today passing the beer test. If I remember, I think that was George W. Bush passed the beer test better than John Kerry, meaning that most people, regardless of their affiliation or their views, saw him as somebody they would sit down and have a beer with. What are your thoughts on Lincoln's ability to change roles depending on what he was doing and what was demanded of him?
It was a necessary skill then, and it is now, and not just for presidents. I mean, don't we all do that? if I'm having a conversation with you on a podcast, I probably am going to try to sound a little different than I would when I'm in the car talking to my wife or in a classroom talking to students. I mean, that's true of us all, and it's necessary. I don't think it's necessarily a sign of insincerity. You know, a job interview is not the same as a barbecue, and so there are different rules for that game. What I find interesting is what we as a society read into that. You made mention of George W. Bush. Think about that. He was the son of a president, the grandson of a senator. He was born a millionaire. He went to 2 Ivy League schools and probably spent more time in Washington, D.C. and Connecticut than he did in Texas. And yet when he ran for president, he seemed relatable, right? Take Donald Trump as a different example. There are a lot of people who really like Donald Trump, and they probably have very little in common with him. He was born to a millionaire. He lives on top of a tower. He's a Manhattan real estate mogul. What does he have in common with millions of Americans who love and support him? I think one of the things he has in common is that he sounds like us and we sound like him. You know, he speaks the way a lot of people speak in their day-to-day life.
Oh, absolutely. So we've been having a really fun conversation with Brian J. Snee. He is a professor at Manhattanville College. His talk is called How the Virtue of Eloquence Became a Vice. And in a moment, we're going to be back with Brian for the Blitz Round. People ask, how could I start a 7-day-a-week podcast? It's because of what I've learned from my mentors. Some of the best mentors in history aren't around anymore. They've left hours of one-on-one mentoring behind in their books. Each month at Classics on Tap, I record a new chapter from a classic business book to help you make a difference. Download your first chapter at classicsontap.com. And it's time for the Blitz Round with Brian J. Snee. This is when I am going to ask Brian a series of either-or questions related to the preparation and performance of his recent branded talk. Brian, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Here's the first question. Were you selected to speak, or did you apply?
I applied. I had to write a 3-sentence proposal. We were limited to 3 sentences.
Wow.
Yeah, it wasn't easy. I bet the first draft was probably 23.
Oh.
But on the strength of my 3 probably very long sentences, I was invited.
So are you a memorizer, an improviser, or a blender?
I tend to be an improviser, and I wasn't that day, and I regretted it. I tried to prepare for the TED Talk by coming very close to memorizing a script, and it didn't work well for me. I would discourage would-be TED Talkers, if that's not how they normally operate, from trying to over-prepare in that way.
Well, that's surprising to me because you fooled me, Brian, because I thought it was an extremely well done talk. And so you just, your point is just leave a little bit of extra margin, available if that's not your normal, if you're not an actor used to memorizing scripts.
I talk to crowds for a living, but a class is a different environment, and I trust myself more in the classroom environment. I thought I would be more comfortable going in with a far better idea of exactly what I was going to say. Lost my place a few times, ended up rearranging on the fly. It came out okay in the end, but it wasn't at all what I was originally planning. I guess this answers the next question. Talk Universe is thinking, yeah, absolutely. Did you have nerves, or were you in the zone, or neither, or both? I'm just going to make this even more painful for you, Brian. Yeah, no, I wasn't tremendously nervous, but a little more than I expected. Again, I talk to people every day, and this talk was held on a college campus, and so I went into it thinking this is just going to be another day at the office. But when you get there and there's a spotlight and a camera and the red carpet, more people in the room than I have in my typical college class, I'd be lying if I didn't say I got at least a little bit nervous.
So obviously this would not include memorizing, but my next question is, what's a tip, technique, or tool that helped you?
by all means, pick a topic that you're passionate about. I think there are a lot of things that we know about because of our careers or our personal life, but just because you know a great deal of information about something doesn't mean you have the passion to really want to speak about it. I think the best TED Talkers are the ones who you can tell are emotionally all in.
This is the cut for time question. What was the most painful part of your talk that you had to cut out?
Well, as I probably intimated earlier, I couldn't mention politics, and I didn't want to. And so it was as if Hillary and Donald and Barack Obama were all there in the room with me, but I couldn't point them out. And so it was trying to have that sort of dual conversation with the audience, the thing I was talking about and the thing I was implying. That was probably the hardest part for me.
Yeah, it was funny because it's covert, but it was also so overt. I mean, really, you can't get around it. If you live in, not even in this country of United States of America that both of us are in, if you are just connected to a news source, you know what the heck is going on. So, final question, Brian, what was the most unexpected, strange, or just plain weird thing that happened during or right before your talk?
The thing I didn't expect but should have was that I couldn't really move. The red carpet was small and the microphone was on a stand, and I don't think they had a camera operator ready to pan left and pan right. So we were encouraged to stand perfectly still during our entire talk. I'm a walker. I walk around when I'm talking, and I couldn't do that. So that was a strange experience for me.
So beware of the micro carpet.
Exactly. Yeah, I was prisoner to it, and it made for a strange experience. A good one, but a strange one.
We've been enjoying this talk with Brian J. Snee. He's a professor at Manhattanville College. You can go to our show notes page at BeTheTalk.com because we will have a link to his talk, which we've been talking about, how the virtue of eloquence became a vice. And you can also link in with him. We'll have a link to Brian's LinkedIn profile, and you'll be able to connect with him from there. And in just a moment, we will be back with Brian J. Snee and his final word of advice for us, Talk Universe. Everyone wants to change the world, but not everyone knows the first step. Before you can change the world with your talk, it has to be selected. So grab the templates, timelines, and tools that I use to get my talk selected at BeTheTalk.com. And we're back with Brian J. Snee. What's your final word of advice for Talk Universe?
To not throw away the virtue of eloquence. You know, when you want a doctor, you want the best one. When you want a lawyer, you want a really, really good one. It is not good for our society if we disqualify from public life those people most capable of telling us clearly, if not eloquently, who they are, what they think, and what it is they want to do. That's an asset that should qualify you for public life, not disqualify you.
Brian J. Snee, thank you so much for coming on the talk today and sharing your wisdom and expertise with Talk Universe.
Thanks for having me, Nathan. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to Be The Talk. For tips and resources to help you change the world, go to BeTheTalk.com. See you tomorrow.